Hi everyone, as Laura is just letting people in, I just wanted to let you know that if you're joining the meeting, if you're joining this webinar, it is being recorded. Feel free to turn off your camera, and we'll start in a bit. So we're just going to wait for about a minute more, and then we'll get started. You want to quickly grab? No, I don't think so. You have time to have tea. Just chill in your seat. All right, great. I think we'll get started now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MMB Webinar Series on Migration. As mentioned in the beginning, this session will be recorded. Feel free to turn off your camera or turn it on, whatever you're comfortable with, but just to let you know that this session will be recorded and later on published. So ACH and University of Bristol have been partnering to deliver this webinar series since 2019. And for the last 5 years, we have led discussions on various migration issues, bridging the gap between academic work and real life practice. And this is the first webinar series for this year. And the topic for today's session is Making an Impact, presenting perspectives from the academic and communities sector. So I am Shalini, and I'll be chairing the session today alongside Dr. Bridget Anderson. Just to give you a bit of background about myself, I am currently working as a senior officer within the research and business development team at ACH. Prior to joining ACH, I had completed my postgrad in University of Bristol. Dr. Anderson was actually my professor. And I was reading migration and mobility studies and focused my dissertation on the integration experience of Rohingya refugees who had been resettled from Myanmar to Bradford in UK. I also worked in a research institute back in Singapore, where I come from, the Asia Competitiveness Institute, conducting work looking at subnational economic competitiveness of Indonesia, India, and China. And whilst doing that, I worked very closely with community leaders from the Rohingya refugee community in Malaysia, developing learning centers for children as children from Rohingya background were not allowed to attend government schools due to their irregular status. So with the community learners, we developed the creation of alternative routes to education. Finally, last year, I was invited alongside Anne Singleton to deliver a seminar on best practices at the International Organization for Migration in Geneva. So it is my pleasure to be carrying the session today. And we've got amazing speakers lined up today, so I'm quite excited. But before we begin the session, some boring house rules that will allow for a conducive discussion. Firstly, just make sure your mics are muted to minimize distractions when our presenters are speaking. We have a designated Q&A session, so hold off any questions until the end. But if you do have a question, you can just see at the top, you will find a Q&A section. You can pop your question in there. When doing so, briefly introduce yourself. So if I were to pop a question in there, I'll be Shalini, ACH, this is my question. Alternatively, just feel free to wait until the Q&A section at the end of the webinar and raise your digital hands, and I will call you to share your question. This webinar centers the discussion, as I mentioned, around impact, and will look more widely at the concept of impact and examine how it relates specifically to refugee and migrant integration. So we have 4 speakers today who will share their findings and thoughts on the subject. Our first speaker is Elin Jones. She is the Research Excellence Framework Impact Associate for Arts, Law and Social Sciences at the University of Bristol, and her role is to support academics to conceptualize the multiple forms of social, cultural, and economic impact their research has, both planned impact and unforeseen impact, as well as gathering evidence of this impact on practice, policy, communities, and institutions. Prior to joining the University of Bristol, Elin completed a PhD in Historical Geography in Queen Mary University of London, and she worked at the BBC as a producer across arts and history programming, and later as a lecturer in maritime history at the University of Exeter. Elin, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes. All right.
Thank you. Just realising how insane my CV sounds. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a second. Okay, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm here to speak broadly from the perspective of the University of Bristol on what constitutes research impact, where that definition and the wider impact agenda within universities has come from, how we can usefully support research impact as an institution, the opportunities this might offer, particularly in relation to the social sciences and to migration studies. And then I'd also like to reflect on some of the challenges which researchers and non-academic partners are faced with when factoring impact into their work. Can everyone hear me okay as well? Shalini, I can see you. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Brilliant. So, I mean, the basic assumption behind the fact that academic research has impact is not necessarily anything new. So the idea that research should in some way be applicable beyond the walls of the university was inherent in the birth of the modern social sciences early in the 20th century, when researchers sought to influence and inform government on issues such as malnutrition, infant mortality, housing and poverty, as they were increasingly seen not as individual problems for individual people, but as societal issues which could be addressed by a researcher taking a bird's eye view and looking for the ways that these problems might be connected. What is new, and what I'm going to focus on today, however, is something which is known either fondly or with derision, depending on who you're speaking to, as the impact agenda within universities, by which I mean the increasing emphasis in academic life, which is put on forming and maintaining relationships with groups, organisations, and communities outside of the university, and the central place which this has in research methods, outputs, and networks of influence which academics have. So the emphasis on this kind of research impact has grown steadily since the 1990s, when concerns were raised by government and academics that there was a disconnect between research and policies, and universities came under pressure to ensure that research could be applied. And since then, the emphasis on impact has grown apace, and academics from all disciplines, not just the social sciences, but history, English, arts, and STEM subjects, are all thinking about how research could be a demonstrable force for positive change in the world. normally through working collaboratively with policymakers, communities, activists, businesses, practitioners, and organisations like ACH, and attempting to move away from that bird's eye view kind of mode of academic view, which I mentioned. And the role of the academic researcher is increasingly becoming understood as more engaged and collaborative in creating forms of knowledge production. This activity has been supported and to some extent driven by the research funding councils, who prioritise research impact in their funding models, particularly over the last 20 years. And of course, this is very kind of prevalent in the workings of the REF, which for those who aren't familiar with it is the Research Excellence Framework. And this is an assessment which takes place every 7 years roughly, and by which the quality of university research is measured. And accordingly, based on your kind of score in the REF, the proportion of a block grant is given out to universities. So the better a university does, the more funding they're allocated. Impact has been one of the 3 categories which are used to assess research by REF since the REF's inception in 2014. And this assessment is made through universities submitting things called impact case studies, which are in-depth documents which kind of detail the work done by an individual or a research group, and then kind of evidence the impact that's had on society, culture, economy, the wider world. The emphasis as an element of research has been gradually growing. So in 2014, the impact, the weighting for impact was 20%. In 2021, it was 25%, and it looks to remain at least 25% for the next REF. And so whilst in an ideal world, REF was supposed to be an exercise of observation, so kind of taking stock of what a university is doing at any given time, it naturally drives university activity and priorities. And so the REF's focus on impact has accelerated the way universities understand, promote, and support forms of research which are impactful. And these are the 2 very, very quickly kind of broad definitions which the UKRI and the REF use to define excellent impact. So an effect, change, or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy, health, the environment, and quality of life beyond academia. And UKRI is even broader, is the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. Now, under these very broad definitions, all kinds of activity are considered impact. This is from REF 2021, and these are the impacts on policy which REF kind of recognises and deems to be excellent examples of research impact. So they're really wide. So it's stimulating policy debate, allowing a public service to kind of be launched that might not be launched otherwise, supporting the work of an NGO, supporting legislative change, research which stimulates critical public debate that leads to the non-adoption of policy. I think that's quite an interesting one. It's not just supporting policy formulation, it's also challenging policies that might have potentially been adopted otherwise. So yeah, there's a very wide range of kind of things that REF recognises. However, happily, they've also kind of the emphasis on just policy has moved to also encapsulate impact on social welfare. And from those very early days of REF, where policy was kind of, and specifically influencing Whitehall was seen as this kind of gold standard of what academics should be doing, there's now a much wider picture of what social impact should look like built into REF. So these are forms of impact which might involve policymakers at a national level, but might also be carried out very locally and involve types of research practice and kind of community engagement, which are carried out with local partners. So research contributing to community regeneration, more effective integration of refugees into host communities, influential contributions to campaigns for social, political and legal change, to engagement with civil society groups. Now, REF's definition, this is all very top-down at the moment, I'm aware. REF's definition has been accompanied, of course, by a critical understanding of what the best practice of research impact should look like in universities. And the University of Bristol, to support this, has developed a broad range of funding schemes which support research activity which is produced with and has a positive impact on wider society. So at the University of Bristol, we run the Professional Liaison Network, which matches academic partners and students with businesses and funds knowledge exchange activities between the two. We have a group here called Policy Bristol, who I work with very closely in the Division for Research, Enterprise and Innovation, and they work with academics to support policy influence, as well as administering and distributing the Policy Support Fund. So again, this is not just thinking about impact on Whitehall and that kind of top level political influence, but it's also thinking about the way academics can work with activists and lobbying groups to help them build capacity and kind of work collaboratively to campaign for change. The public engagement team, who I also work with very closely, is less about supporting change in policy and more about support for academics to engage with a much broader public, often through putting on events and activities which translate research and engage a variety of audiences with ideas and concepts. So they put on Thinking Futures, which is Bristol's Festival of Social Sciences, and also work very closely with individual academics on projects which might largely involve kind of arts, humanities. So there's the civic engagement team, and this work is in line with the university's institutional commitment to civic engagement, and funding is available for projects and initiatives which embed the university in Bristol as a city and positively influence civic life, creating greater equity of opportunity in education and employment, improving health outcomes, supporting social mobility, putting environmental policy into action. And there's also funding available through research centres such as the Brigstone Institute and the Bristol Poverty Institute. Access to the ESRC Impact Accelerator account, which is £1.3 million for a 5-year period, and awards academics kind of blocks of that to carry out work which is seen as impactful. And that funding is applied for by individual academics, but partners often are costed in to kind of contributing to the proposal. So those are the ways that kind of best practice in impact is funded. So I wanted to take a moment to reflect on what the opportunities are for research into migration here in particular, and not just for academic researchers, but what the opportunities are for those wanting to work with universities and how that might facilitate migration research. So one thing which kind of leads on from the last slide is the potential to draw funding for fostering methods of co-production, new forms of research, and ways of implementing those ideas. And there is support from the university to shift the locus of expertise in those kind of working relationships, and to think a bit about how to kind of experiment with different types of co-production. The principles of co-production and the kind of best practice models that come out of them can then, through university partnerships, be enshrined and influence future working. So I've just been working with a group who put together something called the Africa Charter through the Perivoli Africa Research Centre here. And this basically offers a kind of manifesto to foster more equitable collaborative working with partners in the Global South. And by consolidating that in a kind of document, the university is now taking on board the recommendations and trying to kind of recognise and support research partners in the Global South, more than creating this unidirectional gaze of the university onto research partners. So that's being kind of enshrined and is being put into practice within the division I work in and by academics themselves. Through groups within the university, like Policy Bristol, there's the opportunity to use the expertise here to put pressure on policymakers. And there's also, I think, something to bear in mind is that the university offers opportunities for approaching kind of these huge complex issues, like how migrants experience the city, from a really holistic point of view. So interdisciplinary working is actively encouraged and supported in all of these modes of funding and ways of working that I've suggested. So working between arts, law, social sciences, humanities, as well as STEM subjects is really encouraged by those funding pots. And also the civic university networks, which Bristol has, which support with funding, but also capacity building to support better futures for migrants and refugees in Bristol. So that's kind of the pitch for impact at the university. But I also wanted to reflect on some of the challenges of the framework we use to understand and carry out research impact. And I'm not at all saying this is an exhaustive list of challenges, but it's more kind of a few thoughts that occurred to me as I was putting this presentation together and which come up a lot in my working life. The first is REF and co-production. So although methods of co-production are really encouraged in partnership working, the REF impact case study as a kind of document, as a narrative, still encourages this single hero narrative of academic research, and it has the potential of masking the collective nature of research. So although to all intents and purposes, UKRI, Research England and the REF support co-production as a process, it's not always recognised in the way that we're asked to report our research. And I thought this quote was really useful in kind of thinking about that. Co-production as a methodology has the potential to reposition and shift power from the academics to the community, but this process is complex. And I would argue that sometimes the realities of REF paper over those complexities, or ask academics to paper over those complexities. So timelines is another challenge I think that we face as a university. For researchers, especially those working on policy, many of the impacts that they might be looking to make rely on some degree of serendipity, which may or may not tally with the timelines of REF, and more often than not do not tally with the timelines of REF. University funding and research timelines also differ from what is needed on the ground by community organisations, by most other organisations. I mean, the timelines for academic research are quite unusual. And in terms of public engagement, the emphasis put on the magnitude of change, so, thinking that the most successful impact is the one that's the most extensive, means that focus is often on the outcome and not on the transformative potential of participatory process. So by that, I mean that by focusing on how many people are reached, it kind of misses out the fact that in reaching those people, something might have changed or shifted, or perspectives might have altered in order to allow for that way of working. And there are also problems with evidencing changes in perspective, which kind of university research metrics don't account for. So I think I'm running out of time. What I would like to finish by saying is that these are live questions, and that the discussions that we're kind of having in fora like these are crucial to kind of working through some of these questions and addressing them. I think as has been shown over the last 20 years, the university and the REF are impressionable and kind of open to change. So we need to keep talking about meaningful ways that universities can contribute to society and not see these as fixed. So that is all from me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elin. And I particularly love the challenges section, and I think we will discuss a lot more about that in the Q&A. But thank you so much for that. And on time, you still have about 30 seconds left. Perfect. Our next speaker, second speaker, is Dr. Jill Court. She's a Policy and Research Officer at ACH, and she leads on our Changemakers research funded by Comic Relief. The current research project aims to develop innovative tools and techniques to support people from refugee and migrant communities to get the right training and find the right job. So impact has been built into this research design, involving people with lived experience as well as stakeholders from ESOL, training, advice and guidance, and businesses. Dr. Jill is also Honorary Research Associate at the University of Bristol, where prior to working at ACH, she completed her ESRC, funded PhD, which explored the interconnection between language learning, integration, and identity in ESOL learners' trajectories. She has conducted a number of projects to create impact from her research by working with stakeholders to co-produce strategies for ESOL and integration policy and practice, with the aim of improving language learning and integration outcomes for multilingual migrants and refugees. And finally, Dr. Jill has also been involved in evaluating the impact of projects involving refugees and migrants and has a background in teaching ESOL to adults from refugee and migrant backgrounds. Floor is yours, Jill.
Thank you. Thanks, Shalini. I will just get my slides up. Okay, can you see my slides okay? And can you hear me okay as well? Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Shalini, and thanks, Elin, for your presentation. That was really interesting. Yeah, and it made me think a lot because obviously, as Shalini mentioned, I come from an academic background and now I'm working in the community and policy sector. So it made me think about how in planning this presentation for today, I went back to thinking about what impact is. So I will discuss my thoughts as we go along. So the project that I'm going to talk to you about today is our research that we've been doing around improving training and employment outcomes for refugee and migrant communities. So I just want to be really brief, giving you some background to this, because not everybody's going to be familiar with the topic and some of the terms. So as I'm sure everyone is aware that Bristol in the west of England is very culturally rich and diverse, and we have over 90 languages spoken by people, and we have a large proportion of people who have come from overseas to live here. So people from migrant and refugee backgrounds on arrival, they usually have a strong desire to utilise their skills, to find a good job, for example, and to join in with society, but they often face many barriers. One of this is language for some people. So if the most common way of learning English is by attending ESOL classes, which stands for English for Speakers of Other Languages. But language isn't the only barrier that people face. And the ESOL system and the skills and training system in general is quite fragmented in the west of England. So there's many barriers to accessing suitable training and progressing into further educational work. So that's the background of as to why we designed this project. So the aims of the project then are to improve training and employment outcomes for people from refugee and migrant communities by shaping improvement in ESOL and skills training, improving routes into work, and informing more inclusive and effective employment recruitment practices. So we worked with a number of participants, so various stakeholders, so people with lived experience, ESOL and training providers, careers advice and guidance professionals, people from local authorities and the combined authority. And it's part of a 5-year project funded by Comic Relief. And in designing the project, I was intended to build impact into the research design. And this is a brief, I don't know, hopefully you can read the writing on the diagram, but this is an overview of what we did. So we carried out focus groups and interviews, and then we ran some workshops to share the findings and build on them. And then I produced an interim report, which was then shared at the launch event. So this line shows where we are now with the research. And so you can see we have plans to create further impact going forward. So the focus groups and interviews were mainly with people with lived experience of displacement and migration. And I also conducted interviews and workshops with ESOL training, careers guidance and recruitment professionals. So after the interviews and focus groups, I conducted workshops which shared the findings from these, and then we co-produced priorities around meeting the aims of improving employment and training outcomes. And then, as I mentioned, there's the interim report and the launch event, and we had over 50 key stakeholders at the launch event, and the aim was to give everybody to respond and collectively develop the priorities. So I've got the priorities identified in the research. I'm just going to quickly go through them to give you some context for talking about impact. But if you need further information, there's the link to the interim report, which provides full details. So the priorities we identified was a common ESOL initial assessment process for the West of England. I'll give further details about that in another slide. We need to boost provision of vocational ESOL and ESOL for work courses, and provide effective and appropriate work experience so people can gain valuable experience and also references that they may not be able to get in this country. And also a scheme to develop recognition and accreditation of prior learning. So at the moment, many people may come to the country and their experiences and qualifications are not recognised in the UK. Also, we need to improve recruitment processes to make them more inclusive and effective. And then to facilitate all of the above, we need an integrated collaboration between all the stakeholders involved. So this is one of the model about creating impact. So you have your activities that you do in the research, you have the outputs, and then you have the outcomes. So this is short, medium-term changes, or people being aware of and using your outputs. And I was quite interested to see that this, in the REF model, they include a lot of things that I have put as outputs here. And then there's impact, which many people define as the long-term difference that your work makes. So I'm just thinking about some of the short or medium-term changes or impact or outputs or outcomes. So from participation in the research, key stakeholders and decision makers have an increased awareness of the issues that refugees and migrants face around these issues, and also those faced by those supporting them. There was, during the processes of the workshop and the launch event, we collaborated and shared knowledge and good practice. And for example, people committed to stronger collaborations between themselves as well as with us. And people said how the research influenced their thinking or planning of various processes and practices. So, for example, people reported that they were going to increase their vocational ESOL courses, for example, and perhaps change the course content to reflect the findings. And as well as that, in general, in terms of partnership working, the members of the Combined Authority and Bristol City Council who have been involved have invited us to share the findings and work with them around developing a more coherent process around training and employer engagement and improving outcomes for refugees and migrants. Excuse me. So I'm going to go further into a detail of one of the outcomes or impacts. So this was around enhanced regional collaboration around ESOL initial assessment. So a little bit of background. So if you turn up in Bristol and you want to learn English, you will go to a provider who will assess your language level and place you in an ESOL class. But at the moment, there's many providers in the West of England that you might go to, And there is no one single assessment and placement process. There are a few providers in Bristol who have a common referral process, but there's no one single process. So many people face long waits for ESOL. There's over 2,000 people on waiting lists in Bristol, but as well, there are some providers who are struggling to fill spaces in classes that they have. So having a joint ESOL assessment process would facilitate people to get faster access to classes. But this requires participation from the majority of providers, and also people need to agree on a single tool to assess you, to put you in the right level in their classes. So from the research, we found out that there is general support for a common assessment process in the West of England. We had good participation from various ESOL and training providers. And during the workshops, we collaborated to design an initial assessment tool that could be used. And as a result of the research, there is currently a trial of a new version of an assessment tool, which is produced by Community Learning at Bristol City Council. And so the research has facilitated this collaboration and trialing this tool. So it's been a catalyst to move this process forward, and also highlighting the importance of this and gathering support from key stakeholders such as the West of England Combined Authority, the local authorities, DWP, and so on. So that's an example of short-term impact or outcomes, as some people might call them. Now, I want to talk about the long-term impact just briefly to wrap up. So this is what we would like. So we would like changes to processes, practices and policies by training and support providers, for example, local and regional authorities. But the long-term impact that we want overall is improved education and employment outcomes for people from refugee and migrant communities. So how would we evaluate that impact, sorry. So for example, thinking about the common ESOL assessment process that we're hoping will be put in place. So how would you evaluate that? So you would need, for example, to have a majority of providers participating in the process and monitor their retention and get their feedback on the process. And you would expect to see reduced waiting lists and waiting times for ESOL, for example, if that was making an impact. And the need to have integrated collaboration between training and skills partners. So, for example, that might be actualized by having an integrated hub for all the key stakeholders. So then you would look at engagement with the hub, for example, and the retention and how effective people might perceive it to be. And then looking at recruitment practices. So you would need to know about changes in advertising jobs and in job application selection processes. So you'd need that data from employers, for example, a before and after, perhaps. And perhaps you would need to look at recruitment and retention outcomes for participating employers. So the challenge of that would be having baseline data and then follow-up data to see about improvements. And then if we look at the broader impact around actual improved outcomes for people from refugee and migrant communities. So you would expect improved success and progression outcomes. And this data is something that training providers keep. So you could have a look at that and do a comparison. And you could look at whether the proportions of non-UK born in people in work has increased and if they have better jobs, for example. And so that should be available in the annual population survey. And I mean, ideally, you would look at the impact on specific cohorts of people. So, for example, people placed in ESOL via the Common Assessment process. So if you had longitudinal data to see, you know, where they were at the beginning of the process and how much they had progressed later on at a different time point. And also having lived experience stories around progression, around how the process has impacted them. So these are just some of my thoughts about evaluating future long-term impact. And I'll be interested if anyone has any comments or suggestions of this in the Q&A. Okay, so thanks for listening, everybody. I'm going to hand back to Shalini now.
Thank you, Jill. That was amazing, and I really enjoyed reading that report. I had another read through this morning as well. And our final panel of speakers is the third and fourth speakers are Sabita Ravi and Lucy Gilbert. Sabita is the philanthropy manager at Quartet Community Foundation. She advises and guides Quartet fund holders on their charitable giving, working closely with them to achieve the impact they want to see in support of their local communities. She also volunteers for the national grant-making charity, the Henry Smith Charity, as a volunteer visitor. Prior to working at Quartet, she managed a homelessness project and worked within the arts. Looking forward to hearing from you, Sabita. But before handing over, Lucy, I'll just introduce Lucy as well. Lucy is the head of research and learning at Quartet Community Foundation. She works on Quartet's research and learning activities, including writing their social needs reports. Her role includes analysis of the data they hold, understanding impact, supporting philanthropy service, and taking part in new initiatives and collaborations. Lucy has a degree in social anthropology from Cambridge and a master's in development studies from Manchester. And before joining Quartet in 2014, she worked in mental health and homelessness services. Sabita and Lucy, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Shalini. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see this? Brilliant. So hi, everyone. I'm Sabita, and I'm just going to set the scene if I can make my presentation work. Aha! So Lucy's going to talk more about impact, but I thought I'd just give everyone a background, an overview. So Quartet is the community foundation for the west of England. We cover the former counties of Avon, which is Bristol, North Somerset, Bath, and North East Somerset, and South Gloucestershire. We've been going nearly 40 years, so we're growing from a Bristol-focused funder in the early years to covering the whole West of England region. We're part of a national network of 47 community foundations with a physical presence in every part of the UK. And this national network is part of an even larger global network that stretches from America to Singapore. Shalini, where you are. So each community foundation is embedded in its local place and responds to the needs of their local communities. But no CFs are totally alike, but we share some common beliefs and attributes. So one, we pursue long-term change for communities. And to do this, we learn about the local context, collaborate with others to resource interventions, and constantly adapt and apply our knowledge as we go. Two, we inspire people to give locally. To do this, we channel the charitable giving of individuals, businesses, and charitable trusts in our areas who have a desire to create an impact in their communities where they live and work. We also connect businesses and people with local groups to share their skills, professional advice, and services pro bono. And three, we create dialogue between people. We do this by brokering open and honest conversations between grantees and fund holders about the impact of their grants on organizations and those who benefit from their work. We also connect charities to each other, and we work with other funders on best practice. So these are just some headline figures on how and where we are. So when we make grants, I guess this is more about how do we make them. So we recognize there's no one size fits all. So we offer grants in several ways. So we do it through grant programs that have established guidelines and finite pots of funding that we distribute on behalf of others. So there's examples on our website of how we do that. We do it through matching the needs of our communities with fund holder interests. And these tend to involve a wider pool of fund holders and are mostly internally led. So our recently launched kind of resilience grant program, which is around capacity building and resilience in local organizations. And then we also do it through identifying specific interventions. So we made specific grants during the cost of living crisis last year, or supporting larger sectors. So focusing less on an organization, but more on a sector, so a macro view. And within these, we feel that our philanthropic funding is best placed when it supports, in a sense, these three pictures. Small locally based charitable organizations in our area embedded in their communities of interest or geography, organizations with a track record of delivering work that is needs-led, and organizations that address systemic disadvantage. In addition, we want to make grants that can demonstrably benefit the organization, so either through core costs or capacity building grants, their beneficiaries, usually through direct service delivery, or their sector, through partnership working or voice and influence work. We feel we don't set the agenda for the impact we expect. Instead, we trust organizations to decide what the impact of their work is and how they intend to deliver it. We trust also that they'll engage with us when things are not going well, or they need to change suddenly, or the impact will not match what they initially received the grant for. As a relational funder, we try to do this through conversation rather than onerous paperwork, but sometimes we might ask for more information on behalf of our donors. At this stage, I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who's going to talk a bit more specific impact.
Thanks, Sabita. So as Shalini said, my role involves helping us use and learn from our data, try and learn from best practice, and to try and track the impact of our grants and the approach we take as a funder. But before I talk about our approach to impact, I'll share some of the main challenges we find in looking at impact as a funder, because it's actually a lot more tricky than it might seem. So we're a generalist funder, and we can fund almost anything charitable that meets disadvantage across the west of England. So giving out around 900 grants a year for a very wide range of work makes it really challenging to get a sense of the overall impact of our funding. Very often we're comparing apples with pears in trying to get a sense of our impact year on year. Secondly, our average grant size is around £5,000. So the grants we give are more often than not a contribution to a larger project or budget. So teasing out what our money has enabled without overclaiming, which we're really, really keen to avoid, is quite difficult. But on the flip side, there are situations where we know that a £3,000 grant from us, say for scoping work for a larger project or to cover extra staff time to get a new initiative going, really is what makes the difference between impactful outcomes or not. And keeping track of this can be quite complicated in a large and diverse portfolio of grants. And thirdly, reporting timescales, as was mentioned earlier on. Most grant periods last a year or less, and the reporting is almost immediate. So in the case of a grant, say for organisational capacity building or piloting a new initiative, the actual benefits to the organisation may not be known until much later. And this is a real flaw in the funding system, and it limits funders' ability to learn where funding has the biggest impact. And our admin systems. So as Sabita said, we tried to be as flexible and as accommodating as possible. But like many funders, we're constrained by the systems, forms and databases we use, and also the resources we have to track some of this work. It's not quite one size fits all, but our systems do need to be generic enough to cope with everything we do, and bespoking for individual grants or programmes, and also areas where we've tried to focus in on more, metric focused forms of tracking impact, haven't really worked for us well, and they can lead to issues and inconsistencies in our data. And then the final challenge is just around donor needs. So we work with a very wide range of different donors. We're often working to meet a spread of different needs and expectations around impact. So we're not always in control of exactly what we ask for from groups in terms of their impact data. And this can make our data and our analysis a little inconsistent sometimes. So the approach we do take to understanding impact. So firstly, we analyse our end of grant reports, which all of our grantees send us at the end of their grant period. We do read these reports. I think sometimes grantees worry that we don't, but we do. We read all the reports carefully, recording learning and judging how far the organisation has met the objectives set out in their original application. For particular programmes, I'll then analyse the grant programme reports as a whole, looking for common themes, lessons or outcomes among grantees. We tend to look less at metrics and more at those intangible, softer impacts, like indicators of community cohesion, for example. Another method we use is through specific research projects, like the one we were involved in partnership with the University of Bristol, which was incidentally run by the Professional Liaison Network as part of their Bristol model that was mentioned earlier on. And this project attempted to tease out the long-term cumulative impact of our funding in 3 different areas of Bristol. Student researchers interviewed groups about the impact on their organisation of Quartet's support over time, rather than focusing in on individual grants. It was an experimental piece of work, but something we'd really love to do a lot more of, perhaps in the future, ideally in collaboration with university. So thirdly, visits and case studies. So being a place-based funder means that we're here and able to witness the impact of the work that we fund. We try and do visits or meetings and collect case studies where we can to get a richer sense of what's been achieved and develop our understanding of where or how our funding can have more impact in future. And then finally, maintaining those relationships with the groups that apply to us for funding. This long-term view and investment is part of our USP as a funder and helps us understand and contextualise our overall impact. So, for example, our first grant to Bristol Refugee Rights was in February 2006, and that was a month after they became a registered charity. And our most recent grant to them was in January. So we've been alongside them as a partner in their organisational journey. And similarly, Quartet gave Bristol Hospitality Network its first grant for paid staff time to develop what had been a voluntary project. And now they're a key part of the local refugee and asylum seeker sector landscape. So just to give you a quick snapshot of what we've been funding over the last 3 years. We've given out nearly £600,000 in 92 grants. And at Quartet, we've been increasing our support for this sector over time. The vast majority of the funding has gone to organisations working in Bristol. 3/4 of the funding went to refugee and asylum seeker sector organisations specifically, with the remainder then going to non-specialist organisations running targeted programmes. More than half of the funding was used to capacity build the sector, and this included things like staff posts, office space, IT systems, or new services. 31% was used to sustain services or bridge gaps in other funding, keeping a project or staff post going until further funding could be found. And this kind of reflects the mixed strategic approach that we take, acknowledging that it can be harder to get funding for those boring but necessary organisational development grants. And this is one area where we try to add value as a funder. But we also recognise the limits of small, short-term grant funding in terms of impact. We're constrained by the resources available to us year on year, but if there are ways our funding could be more impactful, we're really open to learning and to pivoting. And that's what our sector development programme aimed to do. And I'll hand over to Sabita to give some examples of where that long-term relationship building approach has had added impact, we feel.
Thanks, Lucy. So this is just a really nice quote from Bridges for Communities, which is a organisation that supports refugees and asylum seekers in Bristol. Kind of talking about really that long-term relational piece that we at Quartet do really see as our USB, because we are here for, well, here now and here in the future. But over the last 37 years, we've built strong relationships with the local VCSC organisations, and through feedback from them, we can say that our support has enabled organisations and sectors to thrive. So as Lucy has already explained, tracking long-term impact can be a challenge, and often we don't really know the true impact of our funding until we're in a conversation with our grantees. So a clear example is we funded NextLink, which is an organisation that supports survivors of domestic abuse. We've funded them over the past 6 years through a family fund, and we began the relationship by supporting a discrete piece of work. Once they felt they'd gathered enough evidence of the impact to attract funding from other sources, they asked us to support other work that was hard to find from other sources. My sense is that the work was usually a result of increased need or a desire to create new, more impactful interventions for their clients. And it's only in recent conversations with them through that our role in enabling them to test, react, and embed new work has become clear. And this wouldn't really have happened in the form of a report. I think it's just happened because we have long-term trusted relationships with the organizations where we can have open and honest conversations, and they can talk to us about the impact of our funding in a way that we just wouldn't be able to get on paper, which is very similar to when we were approached by the Bristol Refugee and Asylum Seeker Partnership. So when they approached us for funding, we'd already been talking to the sector about it, and we knew a lot of the charities that were involved in the partnership anyway, through the funding that Lucy's talked about. And although our overall contribution was small, we wanted to support the sector as it developed new approaches and provide flexibility in the knowledge that things take longer and can change as they develop. So these are just examples of where our impact isn't metric oriented and nuanced and less able to put your finger on. But that's kind of the stuff that we're after as well. But it's also an example of multi-year strategic funding approaches where the impact emerges from the long-term open relationships that have been nurtured with organizations. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much, Shalini.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sabita and Lucy. Before we move on to the Q&A, I thought I'll just very briefly summarize the speakers' presentations, which are all really amazing. Elin shared about how impact has increasingly become an important aspect of research, and the university has in place strategies and opportunities to support researchers to embed meaningful impact co-produced by academics in partnership with other stakeholders. Dr. Jill presented about recent research work that she's done and how impact has been embedded in her research work, how she has led the collective development of priorities and commitments alongside stakeholders, and also shared about the outcomes from her work. And Sabita and Lucy shared about the incredible, meaningful work that Quartet Community Foundation is doing. ACH ourselves have also been funded by Quartet before to run a sewing workshop to support Afghan women who were coming under the resettlement scheme, encouraging them to socialize with each other outside of the bridging hotels. And also shared about their very innovative approach to not setting preset impact metrics when looking at grant applications. So we have a Q&A section now. If you go to the top, you should be able to see Q&A. You can pop your questions in there. Alternatively, you can raise your hand. Let me just see. Yes, I see someone raising their hand, so I will look for you. Bridget, yes, Dr. Anderson, go for it. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Really interesting presentation. So I've got one question for everyone, and then one question which is maybe for Jill in her kind of dual role as knowing the academic scene, but also being involved with ACH. So my question for everyone is about politics. So the question of politics, by which I don't just mean party politics, but which can also include party politics. If we want to make a national difference, then sometimes that involves becoming political, I think, especially around questions to do with migration and asylum. But that then obviously raises different difficulties for the different sectors that you're from. So I wondered if you could kind of maybe talk a little bit about, when does research become political? When is that a good thing, and when is that a bad thing? And does this problem with politics then mean that does actually have a negative effect on impact? So that's one question. And then my question for Jill, but I don't know whether other people might also want to chip in, is around collaboration. But in my experience, working with grassroots organizations as an academic, sometimes people they know what they want you to find out. I mean, there's an expectation that you're going to find out certain things. And then sometimes if you don't find out those things, that can then kind of cause friction or challenges for the relationship. So I wondered if you had any experience or thoughts on that. What happens when academics don't find out what people expect?
Whoever wants to go. Oh, so go for it, Elin. Sorry, Elin, we can't hear you. No. No, sorry. We can hear you, but it's coming quite Star Warsy. Yeah, you can. Do you want to leave and come back, and maybe Sabita, Lucy, or Jill want to jump in the meantime?
I'm happy to have a go. I think it's a really interesting question, Bridget. At Quartet, we are independent funders, and I think that's really important because it gives us a perspective which isn't party political. Given the fact that our focus is on systemic disadvantage, I think we would view it through that lens, and we would make a case for funding through that lens. I think my experience is it probably gives rise to interesting conversations in donor relations, because part of our work is making really good grants and making them as transparently as possible, and the other part of our work is inspiring local people to give locally for the grants that we think are really important. So I think in my experience, it's really on the more relational side of donor relations where that might play a part. But I think largely people want to do the right thing and they want to give away money for the right reasons. And so I think for me, it's always trying to keep that at the heart of what we do. And some people will be slow on that journey, and some people will be really fast, and some journeys will be straight, and some journeys will be really convoluted. And I think part of the beauty of philanthropy is that it's not a straight line, but also we're not running a sprint. So, we say we're here for the long term, and we're here for the marathon of it. So that kind of keeps us rooted, I think, to wavering patterns in the external world. I don't know whether that's a wishy-washy answer.
Thank you, Sabita. Lucy, did you want to add anything to that?
No,
And
I
it was
agree.
not wishy-washy.
No, I very much agree with Sabita. I also don't think it was wishy-washy at all. It was very clear. I guess, and just to add, I think that's something that we discuss internally a lot in terms of those lines between what's political and what isn't. As a grant funder, we're not able to fund political activity, but then of course, what that means, there are some grey areas in the middle. If you're looking, say, things like work around climate change awareness and activism and where those lines might fall, and it's certainly something that we reflect on and discuss internally a lot.
Thank you, Lucy. Elin, do you want to try?
Can you hear me? If it's not working, I might just have to sit it out.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, great. So I've been consigned to a shared office which doesn't have great Wi-Fi. So yeah, I suppose from my perspective, I think one of the big challenges around university support for research is making sure that everything isn't ref focused. And I think one of the biggest challenges there is making sure that collaborations and working relationships are continuously supported by the universities and institutions rather than in a kind of a purely responsive way, but it's that a kind of a working relationship that allows for responsive funding to meet specific demands, but which has a kind of longevity and continuity and a kind of strength to address future challenges as well. And yeah, I'm not sure how much that speaks to it certainly doesn't speak to party politics, but I think there's a lot of kind of political machinations within the university that make that challenging. But yeah, so that's my reflection.
Thank you, Elin. Jill, do you want to add on to that? But also there was another question regarding finding out what the grassroots organizations expect you to find out as well.
Shall I just focus on that question? Yeah, because the other one's been answered quite comprehensively. So yeah, I think I haven't actually had the issue of people really thinking that I haven't found what they expect to find, or at least I haven't had that feedback. But I've always been mindful that people they have certain ways of thinking about things, and that you might be challenging that with your research. I've always been mindful. And also the other thing is that not going in, if you're sharing your research with practitioners in the field, not going in as implying that you are the person with all the knowledge. So, this is what I've found, but you have experiences and professional experiences and perspectives as well. So I always think about how to encourage people to allow people to share their perspectives of the topic, of the issues and their experiences, and perhaps if I'm talking about practices, what are the good practices that people are doing that they can share. So I always try and think about how to do that. But the other thing is building opportunities to put their perspectives. So if they have different perspectives, if they think that something is missing from your research findings, then providing opportunities for that. So yeah, I think I'm always mindful that I've done all this research, but I'm not necessarily the person with all the knowledge in the room. I'm not the expert in the room. I have this perspective, but the people in the room that you're collaborating with, they have their perspectives and knowledge, and they may disagree with you. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Jill. Anyone else has any question? You can pop into the Q&A section or raise your hand. I've got my eyes and call you. Yes, someone has. Dan, yes, Dan, please unmute yourself and ask away. Dan, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Dan from Bridges for Communities. We're one of the many grassroots organizations working here in Bristol and in the region. And I wondered if I could put our speakers on the spot a little bit, because I think it's really helpful for those of us who are kind of busy working day to day with people and with communities to hear from a more research and funding and maybe a bit more academic, objective or kind of big picture view. I wondered if any of our speakers are willing to say, if you had one key message for organizations like us on the ground, from your big picture perspective, what you would say, what you would love us to know, or what you would love us to change or do differently or communicate in a different way. Yeah, almost if there was one thing that you could say to all of us that would help in this direction we're all trying to move in, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Dan. Elin, yeah, go for it. Sorry, Elin, we can't hear you. Shall we do Sabita, Lucy, and Jill, and then Elin? If you want to pop it into the chat, that would be great as well, Elin.
It's a great question, Dan. And for me, I think some of that's already been answered. I think the success of BRASP for the sector and how well it's brought people together, how iterative it's been, the generosity of leadership that's been demonstrated I feel like that's already such an amazing thing that the sector's doing on its own, really taking initiative, that I'm not sure I have anything else to recommend really at this stage. So carry on, I guess.
Yeah, I think for me, I agree. It's that collaboration, communication aspect is so useful when a sector is coordinated, and conveying that to us as a funder. It's so much more helpful to understand, where our resources are best placed. And I guess just for me, as somebody who looks at the end of grant reports, I think understanding where the overlap in who people are supporting and who's benefiting from interventions and who isn't, I think that's something that's a little bit missing from my understanding, because we know that the sector collaborates. We know that the same people are being supported in different ways by different organisations. It's then very hard to get a sense of the collective benefit of the support that we give. So to direct type 2 beneficiaries, I think it's easier for us to understand the support to organisations and to the sector, but less for beneficiaries receiving that support. So that's the only one thing I can think of.
Shall I go next? So yeah, I'm going to echo what you were saying, Lucy, about collaboration and sharing knowledge. As you said, there's a lot of great, there is a really strong collaboration within BRASP. I would also say that maybe, because in my experience, I've seen people there's some really great things being done, and some people will say, oh, this needs to be done. And then you find out that some other people are doing this. So I think definitely more knowledge sharing and engaging, maybe widening networks, perhaps, engaging more in organizations further afield, and engaging with research. But then I will say that a lot of people, I know that a lot of you don't have the capacity and time to do that. So it is a bit of a luxury. Just when I've been working with people, quite often people really want to participate, but that, they don't have the time. But yeah, I would say sharing your knowledge and good practices would be a really really great thing, which you do already, but more so. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for answering. And I just wanted to add on that it is like in Bristol, a lot of us do already are sharing the services and make sure it's holistic. So just back to that sewing example that I gave earlier, when we started it, we realized then from Bridges for Communities was also running it, and we came together to see what are the differences and how we can make it holistic so that there's a nice like referral pathway between the two organizations. Because I think it's not about trying to compete, but trying to ensure the service we provide is also different so that it meets and holistically benefits all our service users. And it's great that we are all driven by the same motive, I think. And we've got one more question, I think. Let me see. Emily, yes, go for it, Emily. Let me allow mic. Yes.
Am I audible? Yes, great. Yeah, thank you so much for this session today. Bear with me while I try to formulate my question. I'm a senior lecturer in social psychology at UWE, the University of the West of England, and I chair something called the Global Migration Network, which is a network of scholars that do migration research across the university. Very involved in the refugee and asylum seeker support sector in Bristol. I'm currently running a piece of research for BRASP, so working with all of the different BRASP organizations. We're looking at lived experience leadership within the organizations, which is partially funded by Quartet because it came through the UWE community grant. But my question is about communicating impact and who we communicate impact to and why. Because my experience has always been that communicating impact is something that goes up, right? Like you need to communicate impact to your donor, and then your donor will need to communicate impact to, you know, who, if they have a funding body or if they're accountable to someone. So impact communication is always going up. Recently, on the project I'm running, I was speaking to two of my research team who have lived experience of the UK immigration system as refugees or asylum seekers. And I said, what will success sort of on this project really look like? And they said, well, success will be if there's an actual change that people can see. And that got me thinking about impact down, impact, communicating the impact back to, we've used various terms for them, the service users, the beneficiaries, you know, the members of the organizations. So back to the people on the ground who often are giving us a huge amount in terms of their time to participate in research. So I think it's not uncommon that, like, you know, community members, they might get asked to multiple focus groups or asked to do lots of interviews. You know, they're constantly sort of giving us their time for research. You know, their input, they're our input, right? Like they are providing the research data for us so that we can assess our impact, which we then communicate up. But how do we communicate it back down to them so that they don't feel like they're just endlessly giving us information and they don't see what the impact is? I hope that makes sense.
Anyone is welcome to take that question too.
Okay, I'll start then. I think that's a really good point, Emily. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's some responses that I've had carrying out this research. So people ask me, well, when am I, you know, what are you going to do with this? What, you know, what change is going to happen? And I kind of, you know, have explained that, you know, we will use your suggestions, for example, to influence teachers and training providers, for example. But anyway, so because of that, I thought about ways of trying to communicate what the research has done. I mean, obviously, as I explained in my presentation, whether you can say, you know, the outcomes that I have at the moment, that, you know, that there is some impact in some way, but it's not necessarily long-term impact. But so I had requests from a group for me to go back to them and present my impact, present the outcomes of the research. So I'm going to do that and also write some very plain English, user-friendly versions of the findings and that can be translated and targeted at different people. So if I talked to ESOL learners, it would be, around ESOL, for example. And then, offer again to present to different groups. So that's one way. Obviously, that's not going to reach everybody, but that's one way I've thought around doing it.
Thank you, Jill, Sabita, Lucy, and Elin, if you wanted to add on to that. I also wondered if, and I'm not an academic researcher, but I wonder if just the language of saying communicating up and down reinforces like the power dynamics between researchers and participants, because participants, like Jill was saying, bring their embodied lived wisdom into this. And instead of just being passive subjects that you're going to tell them what the impact is at the end of the day, they are driving the impact together with researchers. If anyone wanted to add on to that.
I think just from our perspective, we're kind of in the middle, really. So we're not a service delivery agency. So I completely appreciate what you're saying from a different sector perspective, where I was on frontline. I know what that means. But I think for where we are with Quartet, we are very much in that middle ground. And we're primarily dealing with organizations on the one hand and donors on the other. But I think with the variety of donors that we have, some of the beauty of it is there's nowhere up to go. It's a family that you're working with. So it's very personal, that relationship. And actually, I think the story of that impact comes around really quickly. Like in the example with NextLink, almost the impact was baked into the relationship. So there was no kind of time lag or decision-making lag. It was all very, very quick. And that's an example of where it works beautifully and really well and can work over a long term. I think I suppose this is more a question really for organizations that are working directly with people about how maybe the change in dynamic or communication happens at that end.
I would just add that I absolutely agree with you, Sabs. I guess the equivalent for us would be our end of grant reports that go to organisations, and we try and keep as Sabta said in our presentation, we don't really set an agenda, so there's no specific questions that we require groups to ask of the people they are working with, because we don't want to set any sort of extractive, awkward, agendas in motion. We just allow the groups to sensitively decide how they work with the people they're supporting to understand what impact looks like and means.
We've just got about 1 minute left. If anyone else wanted to ask a quick question, or Elin, if you wanted to try and see if your mic is working to add on anything.
I'm not sure it is.
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is. Okay, great. I'm not sure how much I can comment on the last question, because I don't actually carry out research myself. But I could respond to your question in the chat, which was how the hero narrative could be challenged within impact measurement, which I think is a really interesting question. And I think there's a lot of, on the part of researchers and universities, there's a lot of willing to challenge that. I think I mentioned the Africa Charter, which is something that academics at Bristol are engaging with at the moment. But until the kind of ref and like the way that research is assessed and measured in universities also changes to kind of keep up with that, there's kind of a dissonance between the best practice from an academic and partner point of view and the way that research is then measured. So yeah, I think it's a problem that requires a lot of conversations, and perhaps academics and the community of researchers putting pressure upwards. And I am hopefully part of that. But yeah, it's a very long-term shift, I think, that we're sort of in the middle of.
Thank you, Elin. And I guess this webinar itself is a conversation starting point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm just going to pass it over to Dr. Anderson for her to wrap up and give any final comments.
Yeah, thanks so much. All of those were really interesting presentations, and I don't know how you managed to pack it in such short time. So thank you so much. I suppose just a couple of observations. So one is that I think we tend to think about academic research and practitioner research and funding as if they're kind of almost siloed off, but we can see just from from the panel that actually academics and funders and people that work in organisations are always mutually influencing each other across different time frames, I suppose, as well. So that was one of the other things that struck me, was the importance of just time, and how what time frame we're using is actually really important, and it's something that maybe we need to reflect on a bit more when we're using a short term, like as Jill sort of really helpfully differentiated between those different timeframes. And I suppose also the question of our different audiences. So to be honest, when Lucy and Sabita were talking, I was thinking, I've never actually thought, of course, you've also got your donors that you need to be speaking to. I tend to just think about the people that you disperse funds to. And I think same for academics, that we've got the people that we're working with, our collaborators, we've also got the ref, but we've also got our other academic colleagues. And I think that's something that we haven't talked about, but is worth kind of putting on the table, is the question of the role of conceptual and theoretical work in all this, because I firmly believe that there is a really important role for that, and that as academics we shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed about that, but that is part of what we bring to the table. And finally, about the research about participation, and the importance of participation and collaboration, but also in making the research process itself impactful, so that impact isn't just something that happens at the end of a research project, but can be something, and I think as everyone kind of alluded to, so I just wanted to bring it out, that actually it's also in the process of undertaking research that change happens. It's not only in the outputs. So thank you, and thank you, Shalini, for chairing, and thanks to Laura as well for all the behind scenes stuff and the organisational work. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And that's the end of this webinar, but I think we'll be having at least one more webinar this year. So do just follow our ACH page or University of Bristol page, and we will be sending out information about the next webinar. Thank you very much, Sabita, Elin, and Lucy, and Jill as well.
Thanks, everyone.